Hi, welcome to the second part of our lecture on inflation. This time we are going to talk about various types of inflation. So basically we can distinguish between three types of inflation, which are cost push inflation, demand pull inflation, and monetary inflation. So as you can see, there can be various reasons for the fact that we've got inflation in the economy. Cost push inflation. This is the situation well described here in this graph. You can see the supply of a certain good decreasing, so shifting to the left, changing the equilibrium situation towards smaller quantities and higher prices. So the price of this good would go up. Obviously, you must realize that that is not precisely inflation. We said inflation is a process of increase in the general level of prices. We show here just one market, one specific good. But there are some goods that have significant influence on prices of other goods. These are things like electricity, fuels, oil, gas that is used for heating, some elements of the costs of labor like social security payments. So if this graph here shows, for instance, the situation on the oil market, then if the price for oil goes up, then certainly that would increase prices of other goods, because the cost of fuel is kind of element of cost structure for virtually every product you can think of. So cost push inflation would be about some, you could say, strategic good that becomes more expensive and pushes costs up. Therefore, prices of goods, generally speaking, in the economy would go up. You can find four causes for cost push inflation. Well, first of all, these could be taxes. So, heavy taxes applied to some industry or to the whole country may increase costs of production and produce cost push inflation. Sometimes this cost push inflation appears because import prices are high. This could be simply because of the general situation in global markets, like for instance oil becomes more expensive, there are such periods, and therefore cost push inflation may appear in many countries. Or sometimes import prices may increase because of the low exchange rate. If our domestic currency becomes weaker and weaker towards, let's say, American dollars, and you look at the cost of oil and the price of oil is expressed in American dollars, so if our currency is weak, then we need to pay a lot of our domestic money for a barrel of oil. Another potential reason for cost push inflation is the change in the wage costs. If wages grow, and if they grow faster than productivity of the workers, that would increase the costs of businesses. Therefore, it may contribute to cost push inflation. And last but not least, this cost push inflation may be simply caused by high interest rates. High interest rates, being the cost of borrowing money, may simply push the cost of bank loans high up, and therefore cost push inflation may appear. How to fight it? Well, basically we should pay attention to eliminating the causes that were listed in the previous slide. So, for instance, we may try to prevent our domestic economy from some external supply shocks by, for instance, making some stocks of oil or gas. We may maintain sufficient level of competition, because if we have monopolies in the economy, or we have businesses that have high market power, like oligopoly, for instance, then it may happen that any supply shocks from, let's say, abroad will be transmitted to our country without any compensation. When we have a lot of competition in the market, part of those costs would be absorbed by businesses that compete against each other. The second type of inflation is demand pull inflation, and this is the kind of inflation we already mentioned when we talked about macroeconomic equilibrium. So inflation may appear when aggregate demand in the economy is too high. Why is that so? Because it is easier for producers to increase prices rather than increase production. It is cheaper, it is faster, it is safer to change price rather than the level of output. Secondly, in a very short run, as you know, supply is inelastic. If supply is inelastic, then you cannot really increase your production over the very short period. So you may respond with prices. Prices can be changed instantly. You can change your prices over 1 hour. So if, for instance, we refer to recent situations and we see that people buy a lot of toilet paper, well, it is easier for producers of toilet paper to increase a price by 20%, let's say, rather than increase the production by 20%. So that's what they basically do. So as a kind of recapitulation, we could say excess demand, too much of aggregate demand, usually translates itself into demand pull inflation. How to fight it? If we want to fight demand pull inflation, we should try to decrease aggregate demand. And obviously, if we look at aggregate demand, we can distinguish those 4 elements like consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. And usually when fighting demand pull inflation, we do not want to decrease investment, because investment is good for the economy. We do not want to decrease exports, because losing our competitive position in the external foreign markets could be quite difficult to compensate later. I mean, if we kind of disappear from foreign markets, it might be quite difficult to enter them again. So in fact, we should focus on consumption and government expenditures. Consumption especially, because it is big. So as you remember, consumption may count as 60 or even 70% of the whole aggregate demand. So if we decrease consumption a little bit, it would have quite significant influence on aggregate demand. How can we decrease consumption? Well, we can decrease consumption by increasing taxes. If we increase taxes, then we decrease income. If we decrease income, then we decrease consumption. We could decrease transfer payments. Again, decreasing transfer payments would mean income is smaller. If income is smaller, then consumption follows. It is also smaller. As you can see, increasing taxes or decreasing transfer payments would be nothing more, nothing less than one of the fiscal policies that we already know. This is contractionary fiscal policy. We can also try to decrease consumption by changing or increasing, to be precise, interest rate. That would be an element of contractionary monetary policy, but we will talk about it when we talk about monetary policy as such. Government expenditures could also be decreased, as if we want to decrease aggregate demand, we can consider cutting on some government expenditures. Decreasing G would again be an element of contractionary fiscal policy. The last type of inflation is monetary inflation. This is inflation that is connected with the incorrect supply of money, too much money in the circulation. This is the type of inflation that was suggested by monetarists, economists that created their school of thought at the end of the 20th century, like 1980s. Monetarists claimed that inflation mostly happens because of the fact that supply of money is too big. Look at this equation that we have here. This is, as you may remember, Fisher's equation of money, or quantity equation of money. M times V equals P times Q. P, the general level of prices. Q, the gross domestic product in a real approach. V, velocity of circulation, and M is the amount of money in circulation. And we said V and Q are pretty stable, they don't change that much. So if there is too much of M, too much money in the circulation, then P grows and we've got inflation. This is something that was experienced by many countries between the First and the Second World War. We mentioned that when talking about money. Remember, money was no longer backed by gold, and we said governments had to learn how to manage money supply. Before that, before the First World War, M was usually limited. It was limited by the amount of gold each country could have. So M, the amount of money in circulation, was related to the amount of gold they had. So that was pretty stable. That was a kind of an anchor. But then when you give up convertibility to gold, then M can be shaped pretty freely, and this is the danger, because as you remember, we can print too much money and we can trigger inflation, and we could see that in the period between the First and the Second World War. So how do we fight monetary inflation? We keep supply of money under control. The extreme view of monetarists says, well, since the economy can develop by 2 to 3% per year, so Q, this real GDP, grows by 2 to 3% per year, and we want P to be stable. We know that V is pretty stable. So if V is stable, if Q grows by 2 or 3%, then M should also grow by 2 or 3% to keep P, the general level of prices, stable. This is the opinion that is not shared by most of economists, but monetarists, especially those extreme ones, would claim that. Anyway, it is kind of well accepted by economists that money-related factors are important when it comes to inflation. So that's why in most countries this is the role of the central bank and monetary policy to keep this monetary inflation under control. In the recent years, however, there are some doubts here about this monetary inflation. Remember the program of so-called quantitative easing. So speaking bluntly, this is like printing money, and it was carried out in the USA, in Europe. A lot of money was introduced to circulation. This supply of money was increased quite considerably, and we couldn't actually see any kind of result of inflation growing in those countries in the Eurozone or in the USA. It seems that now with this virus situation, we will probably see even more of quantitative easing, and again there are some economists that believe that that could lead to a high inflation in the years to come. Well, time will show, certainly. The rate of inflation. We can characterize inflation judging by how quickly prices grow. So we start with a small inflation, we call it creeping inflation, so it does not exceed usually 5% per year. You can see the reflection of that when you look at the inflationary goal of Polish Central Bank. It is set at 2.5% a year. So this is the inflation that the central bank in Poland tries to have. Actually, the Central Bank of Poland keeps this inflation, desired inflation, within a certain range. So this is 2.5% plus minus 1%. So it is good if it is between 1.5 and 3.5%. Such low inflation is not usually perceived as any kind of danger. Actually, there are even some benefits of a very small inflation. Moderate inflation is over 5% to, let's say, approximately 10% per year. So we would say, well, the general level of prices is growing quite quickly. We don't like this kind of situation, and some policies should be used to lower this inflation again to the range of the creeping inflation. Over 10% per year is usually perceived as galloping inflation. That is inflation that is harmful for the economy, and that means we should really take care about this kind of inflation, because it may develop and it may transform into hyperinflation, hyperinflation being 200% or even more per year. You know, hyperinflation means that there is something really wrong about the monetary system of the country. So this is a sign of a serious problems for the economy. As you could notice, I said it's about 5%, about 10%, usually like 200%. You can find those thresholds for different types of inflation, different in different textbooks. What I want you to remember is the fact that those borders between creeping, moderate, galloping, hyperinflation are not very much fixed. I mean, creeping inflation could be 5, but actually it could be 6 as well. Creeping inflation should be a small inflation. Hyperinflation. It doesn't matter whether we declare it starts with 150% or 200% or 300%. Hyperinflation is a very high inflation. And whether it is 150 or 200 doesn't really matter. So 10% as a kind of a border between creeping inflation and between moderate inflation and galloping inflation, this 10% is not a certain magical barrier. It's not a magical number, 10%, right? Around 10% we say this is a high inflation. It is very high moderate. It is this low galloping. Well, this is something that we should remember. The higher is the rate of inflation, the more problematic it is. And this rate of inflation has the tendency of not being very stable. I mean, inflation is often found to be able to develop, to speed up the rate. How does it happen? Have a look here. This is the inflation spiral, as we say. The beginning is with the higher prices at the upper left corner of our diagram here. Those higher prices would provoke people to claim for wage increase. If prices grow, we want to earn more. If we push our claims and if our wages go up, then the increase in wages results in two things. First of all, if our wages go up, then it means our income increases. If our income increases, that produces extra demand. And this extra demand for goods and services would be one of the reasons for higher prices. We know when demand grows, it would push prices up. Those higher wages, on the other hand, would also influence the cost structure. Higher wages would push costs up. Higher costs and extra demand. These are two reasons for higher prices. Those higher prices provoke us to claim for wage increases, and the whole thing starts to repeat itself. So we start in a kind of a vicious circle here. This inflation spiral will have the tendency of going on and on, because if we see prices growing in the economy, again, the upper left corner of the diagram, prices being higher and higher, that builds in the society the expectations, the so-called inflationary expectations. People expect that prices in the future will be even higher. So if they expect prices to be growing and growing, their wage claims would be even higher. We want to get more money, we want to have a higher wage, not only because of the price increase that we already experienced, but also because of the fact that we expect some more increases in the future. So we want to be compensated for the future increases as well as the past increases. So our wage claims are even higher, which increases costs. Inflationary expectations will usually be reflected by higher interest rates. If those higher interest rates appear in the economy, they will increase the costs even more. So we've got two factors for increasing costs: higher wage claims and higher interest rates. If costs are growing, that would translate itself into higher prices. Higher prices would strengthen the expectations of even higher prices, would strengthen the inflationary expectations, and the whole circle is going on and on and on. As you can see, inflation can be pretty dangerous. Once started, there is no mechanism to slow it down. There is no mechanism to stop this process. Actually, this process has the tendency to go on and on and on, and it will magnify itself through the expectations, inflationary expectations. To what extent inflation is problematic for the economy? There are at least 5 important, significant costs that are imposed on the economy by inflationary processes. So these are changes in relative prices, redistribution of income, higher level of uncertainty, deterioration of balance of payments, and last but not least, use of additional resources because of inflation. All those 5 costs will be discussed in the last part of our lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye.